My neighbor knocked at 5 a.m. and told me not to go to work. Have you ever wondered how it would feel if the police told you they had video of you committing a crime while you were sitting safely at home? That's what happened to me. Right after my neighbor woke me up at 5 a.m. with a warning he refused to explain. At first I thought it was all a mistake until they listed things only I should own that were found at the scene. That's when I realized someone wanted to erase me. And the reason they chose that day, that's the part you need to hear. Imagine being woken by a stranger who knows your name, but won't say why, then watching your normal life unravel in a single phone call. This chapter shows how a single decision, trusting someone at dawn, can become the hinge of a whole life. I'll tell you exactly what happened in those first frantic hours and why the smallest choices matter when everything else feels out of control. I was asleep like any other Thursday. The kind of careful sleep a 33-year-old who keeps lists, takes bills paid, lunch is packed, alarms set. The knock was 3 quick, tense raps at my front door. I remember thinking, who goes door to door at 5 in the morning? Then my neighbor's voice, Alyssa, don't go to work. He sounded urgent, like someone whose insides were electric. The name he used, my name, sounded both familiar and foreign coming from him. I opened the door, and there he was, Gabriel Stone, hands in his coat pockets, eyes hollow and desperate. He wouldn't explain much. That was the strangest thing. He was terrified but tight. He told me to call in sick, to stay in, and that I'd understand by noon. That's it. No details. If you've ever been asked to make a risky choice with no explanation, you know how the mind does math. If he's wrong, I lose a day of pay. If he's right, I could lose everything. I called my manager, mumbled something about food poisoning, and settled onto the couch with my phone like a lifeline. While I waited, my head did what grief's exhausted brains do. It wandered back through my life looking for patterns. I thought of my father, the recent sudden stroke that had left his desk cluttered with odd notebooks and encrypted printouts I'd never read. I thought of small, weird snapshots that had nagged me for months. A flicker of a camera light in the parking lot, a voicemail with the sound cut out at the last second, a neighbor's glance that felt like a calculation. None of it made sense, but it felt like the edges of a hidden picture trying to focus. Then the call came. The officer's voice on the other end was flat, professional, practiced. There was a violent incident at your workplace this morning, he said. Security footage shows you arriving at 8:12, and your badge was used to open the employee entrance. I felt a disconnect I can only describe as surreal. My hands clutched the phone as if the device itself might become slippery and fall away. I was home. I had been home since dawn. I told him so. He read facts back to me. My car had been used, an access card, personal items found. When he listed items only I would own, the world started to tilt. That is the point when suspicion stops being a thought and becomes a fact you can't ignore. I glanced at the door, at the street, at Gabriel's tight face through my front window, and felt like a character in a story someone else was writing. There was no longer room for indecision. The police believe what the footage and the badge logs say, but footage can be manufactured, and the next part of the day would prove just how carefully someone had planned this. What would you do if the police told you they had proof you were at a crime scene but you never left your couch? This chapter follows the moment facts that should clear me instead become nails in a coffin. I'll describe the evidence they presented and why the smallest detail made everything look engineered. The officer kept his voice low, as if reading the results of a lab experiment. He was calm, in a way that made his words heavier. Badged scans with timestamps, footage from 3 angles, my vehicle tracked by parking gates, an item in the suspect's possession that came from my purse. Each piece of evidence was a small, certain machine, no emotion, only data. The combination felt like an airtight alibi of guilt. I asked questions. How could that be? Who had access to my badge? Where was my car between 5:30 and 9? The officer pivoted to facts he could confirm and declined to speculate. That silence carried the weight of accusation. I tried to remember every face at the office, every colleague who might have a motive. None of it fit. But in those moments, I realized being innocent is not the same as being believed. Gabriel stayed on my stoop, and when the officer asked for a statement, Gabriel spoke up not as a neighbor, but as someone who somehow knew the edges of the case. He told them he'd been keeping an eye on me, that my father had asked him to watch over his daughter. The officer's interest peaked, but even that didn't stop the details stacking up. They told me they'd need to take my phone, my keys, and my badge for evidence. I handed them over like a ritual offering. each item feeling heavier than it should. The idea of identity, what it means to be you, your name on a badge, your car in a garage, the microchunk of DNA in your blood. Someone can copy those things now. The question became, who would go to such lengths to create a false narrative? Who would want Alyssa Rowan to be both the victim and the perpetrator? As I sat there empty-handed and watched, I realized my father's messy desk now had a context. It wasn't just curiosity or research. It might have been a red flag. The police left with my belongings and a gentle warning. Don't leave town. They said it like they meant to help. I felt like a ghost at my own life's crime scene. Gabriel's presence stopped being a coincidence. He had a past with my father, and when he stepped inside my living room with a sealed envelope, everything shifted again. When a stranger says he moved next door because your father asked him to, you can either laugh it off or listen. This chapter reveals how Gabriel's quiet confession rewired everything I thought I knew about my father and why I was suddenly the target. Gabriel sat across from me like someone who'd rehearsed his lines too many times to shout. He placed a folded, worn envelope on my coffee table, as if it were a lit fuse. He asked me to watch you, he said simply. The way he said it made the words heavy. He didn't explain why at first, only that my father had trusted him, that there were things he couldn't say over a phone, and that I should come with him when the time came. He told a story in pieces, a friendship forged in late nights over data, a partnership that became suspicious, a man, my father, who stumbled onto a pattern too big for him to handle alone. Gabriel's voice softened when he mentioned the last time he saw my father, how different he looked, how afraid. He handed me a small, grainy photograph of my father with a man I didn't recognize, faces serious, hands on a file. The photo looked like a crime scene prop, edges blurred, the kind of image you'd find in a dossier. I asked the question, why me? Gabriel's answer was simple and worse than any explanation. Because your father left instructions. He produced a note from inside the envelope, the handwriting familiar and slanted like pages I'd seen in my childhood. It said, "Trust Gabriel. If I'm gone, he is to keep you safe. Follow him." There was more references to files, a key card and a name, Subject 7B. He watched my face as if tracking where the pieces landed. Subject 7B sounded like a label from a lab, not a name for a person. Gabriel explained that my father had been investigating something covert, a program that used biological data to engineer people. He didn't say programmed lightly. It came out as if he'd been swallowing the word for weeks. When he finished, the room felt smaller. The stakes felt bigger. His story gave me choices: disbelief, panic, or action. Panic felt indulgent. Disbelief felt naive. We decided, without much pomp, to act. Gabriel said he had a car ready, a safe place where my father kept backups of his work, and a file that might explain why I, specifically, had been targeted. The urgency returned and marked vans could be still cruising our blockhand. With every passing second, the choice to leave seemed both reckless and necessary. Inside my father's vault, the truth would begin to take form: notes, encrypted drives, and a label that explained why my life was worth erasing. In a dusty vault, a notebook can feel like a detonator. One page can blow a case wide open. This chapter walks you through what we found in my father's hidden vault, and how a single journal rewired my understanding of who I was. We drove with the windows up, speed brisk enough to feel like we were edging away from something, and slow enough to keep mistakes to a minimum. Gabriel's hands were steady on the wheel, his jaw set. He'd mapped the route to an old safe deposit room my father used when he wanted things hidden. It smelled like metal and old paper, the kind of scent that makes secrets feel ancient and inevitable. Inside the vault were small things that meant more than their size. A flash drive taped to the underside of a drawer, a handwritten log with dates and times, and a leather-bound journal with my father's name inside. My fingers traced his handwriting like a map. The pages were full of observations, lab notes, meeting names, names crossed out, a cryptic list that included immunity markers and acquisition protocols. He'd written like a man who knew he might not finish. One entry hit me like a physical push. He'd labeled a section, Alyssa Note. The page described characteristics of what he called Subject 7B, rare blood markers, unusually resilient immune responses to engineered pathogens, and a comment: not manufactured, born this way. My stomach dropped. He'd been tracking me like a scientist tracks a variable, but the tone was not clinical. It was protective. The final lines were personal: a plea, a confession. If they come for her, tell her to run. Trust Gabe. Another piece of paper tucked into the journal was a schematics printout. Diagrams of lab layouts and names of contractors that read like ghost corporations. My father had clearly gotten too close to something he shouldn't have. Why would a biotech program label a person like a file? Because in the eyes of whoever ran this, people were data points, and data points were valuable. We copied everything. Gabriel fed the drives into a burner and duplicated files onto multiple storage devices. I felt oddly Comaction has a way of focusing terror. Still, as we left the vault, the decision we'd made to expose this all felt both right and foolish. If the journal proved anything, it was that my father had been brave and reckless. He'd trusted the wrong people to protect the right truth. The files painted a picture, but they also put a target on my back. Once you have proof, you become a threat. The next move would bring the danger back to the surface. Proof is a double-edged sword. Release it, and the hunters sharpen their knives. This chapter covers the moment the network that erased my father tried to finish the job with me in the CROSHAIRS. No sooner had we duplicated the files than the world outside shifted. Unmarked cars slowed past my street in rhythms that looked practiced. My phone vibrated with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and one from a blocked line that played nothing but static. We tried to keep our heads down, but the city has a way of watching with 1,000 eyes. The security footage that had proved I was at the office was suddenly less surprising. In the same way, a magician reveals the trick's angle. You can see how someone sets up an illusion if you look at the edges. At noon, alarms shrieked somewhere down the block. We looked at each other and knew it was on. Gabriel drove like someone who had outrun trouble before. Fast turns, calculated pauses. We lost a tail at a junction where 2 delivery trucks had synchronized like a county-wide choreography, but it was a temporary reprieve. Later that day, helicopters appeared in the sweep of dusk, too many for a single city suburb and too coordinated to be random. I learned something terrifying about people who think in systems. They don't just act, they simulate. They had built falsified logs, planted items, and used inside access to make me the face of an atrocity. The goal was neat and ruthless: make me guilty in the public eye so they could take anything tied to me, my father's work, my father's contacts, my identity, without anyone asking questions. When the chase tightened, we split up, because staying together made us easier to lock down. I went to a safe house my father had listed in the margin of his journal, small apartment belonging to an old friend who owed him a favor. There, isolated and wired with paranoia, I watched the news. The footage they showed was edited, a montage that pushed narrative over nuance. It presented me as daring and dangerous, not as someone framed. It's one of the cruelties of modern spectacle. A well-cut narrative looks like truth. Meanwhile, Gabriel prepared to take the files public. We had to decide how to release them without allowing those who hunted us to shut the pipeline. He had contacts, journalists who hadn't been bought, a coder who could help leak files to multiple nodes at once. The risk was enormous. If they traced the leak back to me, the outcome would be worse than erasure. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt like complicity. As we plotted the reveal, a pattern emerged in the files that made the stakes deeply personally clear. The program wasn't just about control, it targeted people like me for a reason tied to family. When you stitch together enough small anomalies, a pattern appears and it will terrify you. In this chapter, I explain what the files revealed about the program, who it targeted, and why my father's research mattered more than I'd ever known. The files were dense. Proprietary jargon layered over redacted memos, payroll statements, and travel logs. But beneath the corporate obfuscation, there was a clear motive. The program pursued a genetic trait they called an intrinsic immunity vector. In plain terms, some people were naturally resistant to engineered pathogens and immune suppression. Those people were priceless to organizations trying to create biological tools or weapons that could resist countermeasures. By my father's notes implied something deeper. Someone had tried to synthetically reproduce the trait. Others had been acquired to study why they had it naturally. The pattern in the acquisition logs had a disturbing cadence: poor neighborhoods, isolated researchers, people who lacked powerful advocates. When a natural subject was found, they were taken offline, quietly acquired, either to be studied or removed. The language was careful but cold: tests, protocols, acquisition. Why me? The notebook had the answer in a way that felt like salt poured in a wound. My family lineage, small town, understated, contained a rare convergence of markers. My grandmother's death, which I had assumed was old age, now seemed to sit suspiciously with a notation: Autopsy inconclusive, tissue sample missing. My father had noticed similarities across files, names, locations, obituaries. He'd tried to map it and in doing so had made himself a target. We also found a list of contractors, pharmaceutical shell companies, and a private security firm with a strange hold on medical records. Those companies were the muscle that turned research into action. The implication: whoever controlled the program could pick who lived and who disappeared, and they had the money to rewrite systems. The goal wasn't merely scientific curiosity, it was power. The more we read, the more the program's moral depravity revealed itself. It weaponized life and rewrote identities. The thought that my father had died trying to stop this felt both heroic and horribly naive, but it also gave me something: an enemy with a mapped structure, weaknesses, and names. If you want to topple a hidden machine, you need a map, and my father had left one. The map pointed to a single decisive choice: give myself up to be acquired under supposed protection, or expose the program and risk everything. I knew which path my father wanted me to take, but which would actually save people. Faced with an impossible choice, some people hide and some people fight. This chapter is about the moment I had to decide: surrender to the system for safety, or release everything and become a target to protect the truth. We sat in a diner that smelled like coffee and burnt sugar, our faces lit by pale neon. Gabriel slid a printed email across the table, an offer, thinly veiled as protection. Come in willingly, undergo a monitoring program that would keep me safe under their terms. The language was sanitized, but the bottom line read like a contract: your life will be exchanged for your silence. In another folder, Gabriel had a plan for a public leak that would name names and provide documentation to media outlets and open-source repositories. It was a moral calculus with no clean answer. Surrender might keep me alive. It might even let me keep my identity on paper, but it would also grant the perpetrators the thing they wanted most: control. They could then continue their experiments, taking others in my place. Revelation would save more people, perhaps, but at the price of becoming a hunted one-person army. I thought of my father's journals and the way he'd written about responsibility. He didn't couch his last instructions in ambiguity. He'd chosen for me when he could no longer choose for himself. I could follow his path and expose them, or I could survive by agreeing to be contained. The choice felt like choosing between being alive and being complicit. We chose revelation. The leak was surgical. Gabriel used burner phones, multiple uploaders, and a chain of journalists and independent researchers with reputations they weren't willing to sell. Files receded on encrypted forums and newsrooms were given timed access. The effect was immediate and viral. Within hours, snippets appeared in headlines, watchdogs cried foul, and activists began to pore over the data like vultures and saints combined. The secret machine had been pierced, but as the files spread, alarms did too. People on our street began to look up more often. The program's operators had resources to act. They wouldn't simply bow to public scrutiny. Their first moves were to discredit leaks, label them as fabrications, and accelerate an effort to find their leak source. The danger had escalated from theoretical to tactical. Exposure changed the world overnight, but it didn't keep me safe. The hunt intensified, and the true faces behind the program would finally start to emerge. When a secret is exposed, the reaction is swift and ruthless. This chapter covers the aftermath of the leak: how the program fought back, how the public responded, and the moment the hunters went from concealed to brazen. The media cycle was a living thing. Reporters called, anchors demanded comment, and conspiracy boards exploded with fragments of data and wild theories. For a short, luminous period, we had the moral high ground. People asked questions, committees opened investigations, and the program's contractors scurried to scrub their online footprints. But cleansing isn't the same as accountability. Money moves faster than outrage. Retaliation was clinical. Lawsuits were threatened. Witnesses were intimidated. And people close to my father received visits that were less about conversation and more about constraint. I learned that power has a middle management of fear, men in suits who do the dirty work, while the bosses stay anonymous. One of Gabriel's journalist contacts was followed home. Another had her apartment ransacked and her notes taken. The message was clear: expose us, and we will make you regret it. Then, the hunt became personal. A man from my father's notes, a contractor who'd been aggressive in covering tracks, was suddenly named in a leaked ledger. That ledger also contained an address that was alarmingly close to my grandmother's old town. I realized then that the program didn't only reach forward into Labzet, had its fingers in the past. In funerals and old hospital records, my family had been collateral. We tried legal channels. We reached out to watchdogs and civil liberties groups. A few brave reporters dug in and published deeper pieces. The public, for a while, rallied, but outrage is a fickle currency. It can topple a reputation but rarely a machine. As the weeks passed, the initial heat cooled in public attention, but the machine's pursuit persisted with less discretion. One night, the place we'd been using as a temporary safe house took a hit. Unmarked vehicles surrounded the building. We escaped by the skin of our teeth, splitting up and using routes only my father's old friends knew. It was chaotic and terrifying. In the days after, I realized we had bought a moment of breathing space, but not peace. Exposure had changed everything. Now I had to decide what to do with the last lever left. My own story, told in my voice, in a way that refused to be edited. When the dust settles, your story is all you have. In this final chapter, I explain why I chose to keep fighting, how we turned the attention we had into leverage, and what it meant to step into the life my father thought I could live. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes when you accept that safety, as you once knew it, is gone. I could have disappeared, let the program scrub me clean, and hoped to live a shadow life. Instead, I chose to take control of the narrative. Gabriel and I coordinated interviews with journalists who wouldn't be cowed. We gave testimony, we released more files carefully, and we pushed for an independent inquiry with documented evidence that even the most well-funded PR campaign couldn't erase. Choosing to fight wasn't about heroism, it was pragmatic. Public scrutiny made it harder for the program to do anything overt without consequences. Lawsuits and public inquiries carry paperwork that's slow, yes, but it also creates traceable records. We turned the program's need for secrecy into its weakness. The more they tried to silence us, the more eyes they attracted. There were costs. People I loved were cross-examined. Friends were threatened. We lost anonymity and gained a target. But we also forced questions that couldn't be shoved back under the rug. A small but growing coalition of scientists, lawyers, and advocates began to assemble. The inquiry's early findings were messy and partial, but they mattered. For the first time, institutions that had been complicit in obfuscating the program were asked to explain themselves. Most importantly, I took back a piece of myself. The label Subject 7B was a reductive number intended to depersonalize me. By speaking, by insisting on my name and story, I reclaimed my identity. My father's death was still a wound, but it became impetus. The man who had always told me to keep receipts and write things down had given me something else. The tools to continue his work were not done. Some faces behind the program remain in the shadows, and some answers are still sealed. But the decision to expose rather than surrender set a course. There's danger ahead, yes, but also purpose. To protect other people from becoming data points, and to make sure the kind of erasure my family suffered cannot be done quietly again. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.